Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Today I'm recording this lesson because I am not here. If you are in my online class, then you are just watching this lesson in order to be caught up so that tomorrow we can work on our discussion post activity. If you are in my fourth period in-person class, then you should have a graphic organizer in front of you and you're going to be filling this out along with me in order to take notes. All right, so I'm going to show you where we're going to be finding the information from in case you have your own device and you want to follow along with me. You're going to go into our course and go to Unit 7 under Week 1, and you're going to find this under Bring on the Reform Reading. When you click on that, we're going to skip to page 2. And we're going to scroll down to just this part right here that says then and now. And I'm going to actually click leave student view so I can get a bigger screen. But there we go. I'm going to go back to page 2. Okay, so this is actually the only part of this that we're going to use today is just this little slideshow right here that says then and now. All the rest of this lesson we're not going to use, but this portion right here is going to give us all the information on all of the different social reform movements that we're going to be talking about today. Yesterday, we talked about the prison and education reform movements, and those are also included in this slideshow. So it's going to be a little bit of a review for those ones. But today, we're also talking about children in poverty, deaf and blindness, mental illness, which is also kind of going to include the prison reform, and temperance, which is alcohol. So we're going to go through each one of these little by little. It's going to talk about what life was like back then and how the reform movement changed things nowadays, and also who was the reformer, like who was the person who spearheaded that reform movement. Now, if you were in my fourth period in your graphic organizer, you're also going to be looking for what time period or what year this reform movement happened. And then make sure that you're taking notes on that, what life was like before the reform movement and what life was like after it. And it's going to be pretty clear when you see it. So we're actually going to go ahead and start with children in poverty. And you can see how it's laid out, what life was like then, now, and then we'll go into the person. So what life was like back in the 1800s for children in poverty. So basically, children without families to care for them lived difficult lives in the 1800s. Religious groups ran orphanages and they provided other help, but the number of children in need kept growing, especially in cities where the populations were really, really big and a lot of families, had to go to work and they just couldn't take care of their children. Many kids spent their nights on the street hungry, cold, and alone, and it was just a growing problem for children in poverty. Now, what life is like today for children in poverty. Today, poverty and homelessness is still definitely a problem. It's widespread for Americans, but however, every U.S. state has some kind of an agency that runs and monitors, those people and tries to help them in need. Taxpayers also fund um, taxpayer funds and generosity help support the programs also as well. So if there are people who are in need, they can get some kind of assistance to help them. Like if you are out of a job or if you have a job and they just need more help, like food or things like that, medical care, then we do have systems in place to help and they're not just sleeping in the street. I mean, that still does happen nowadays, but it's not as widespread of an issue as it was back then. For the year, it was kind of just throughout the 1800s. Now, for the person, we have the reformer, Charles Loring Brace. He founded the Children's Aid Society in New York City. He wanted to help the city's poor children. Some lived in orphanages, on the streets, or with families unable to care for them. One of his programs was to place out children with families in the West who would raise them and teach them good habits. So basically like the foster care system. Rural families were eager to help kids on their farms. The children would have to help with the daily chores, and sometimes the families valued them only for their labor. So it sounded like a good idea, but it kind of not ended up not being a good idea because they were almost treating them like servants. Like they were eager to get them because it was like free labor. Now, these orphan train riders is what they would call the people who would take in the orphans just for like labor. They were usually between a few months and 14 years of age, and many families adopted the children, but it was not common until after the 1900s. So, Charles Loring Bracy had like a great idea to do this, but it was not um, always the best case scenarios. I'm sure there was a lot of people who really loved the kids and adopted them and wanted them to be a part of their families, but sometimes people didn't have the best intentions. All right, so that's children in poverty. All right, now let's move on to education. And this is going to be kind of a review because we did talk about education reform yesterday. But back in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, no laws required school attendance. So people did not have to send their kids to school. Most children worked to help support their families, either on the farm or in factories. And those who worked or learned to read and write usually learned at home or through church. Wealthier families might have sent their children to small private schools. So school was kind of a luxury and not really something that was mandatory. Nowadays, education is mandatory for all young Americans. Child labor laws protect young workers from conditions that would interfere with school. So kids cannot go to work until a certain age. You have to attend school. And even if you are a certain age and you're allowed to have a job while you're going to school, you can only work a certain amount of hours so that you can prioritize school. Students attend school in a variety of ways, such as public, private, charter, online, and homeschooling. So there's different options for kids, but either way, you have to go to school. And the person, the reformer that we know is Horace Mann. And Horace Mann was a key person in bringing education to all young Americans. He lived in Massachusetts, and thanks to Mann's efforts, his state was the first to pass a law requiring all people under the age of 15 who worked in factories to attend school at least 3 months of the year. So it was not much, but it's better than nothing. In 1855, the state passed a law requiring the schools to admit students no matter their race, color, or religious opinions. So we did talk yesterday about how, during the education reform, sometimes there were those minority groups of people like girls or children in poverty or the African American children that they a lot of times were like left out, and it was oftentimes just kind of like the white males who were offered education. Later on in 1855, in Massachusetts at least, they did pass a law that said everybody had to be offered education. Everywhere else, not so much, but eventually it would come to that point. All right, so that is education reform. All right, now let's talk about deaf and blindness. So in the early 1800s, Americans who suffered deafness or blindness, or sometimes even both, they had little outside support. They were dependent on their families or church groups, and learning to communicate with others was a great challenge. Many never learned to communicate well. We know that people who are deaf or blind, they have to have special means of communication, whether it is through assistive technologies that we have nowadays or people learning sign language if they are deaf or blind, they have like the walking canes or seeing eye dogs. Like there has to be some kind of accommodation that helps these people in order for them to live normal lives. Well, back then, people who had these disabilities, a lot of times they were just kind of shunned from society. And it was very unfortunate because they could not live normal lives. They just were almost relying on their families for everything. They couldn't go out and do anything with their lives. So today, things are very different. There are laws that protect people with a variety of challenges in different areas of life. For example, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is called the IDEA for short, says that children with disabilities must have equal access to education. So everywhere across America, there is this law that says no matter what your disability is, that every person has the right to equal education in America. Teachers with extra training and even whole schools exist to support students with various learning challenges. And even like we just talked about, there are tons of accommodations that people who have disabilities can get. You know, if you are deaf or blind, there are different things that you can have to assist you, assistive technologies to help you, or, you know, anything that you need in order to help you in your life so that you can live a normal life. Now, the people that we have here who helped out, the reformers, we have Thomas Gallaudet and Samuel Howe. So these two men both helped to bring education to more of America's youth. Gallaudet researched how to educate deaf children and helped develop ASL, or American Sign Language. Howe researched blindness and helped increase the printing materials. So he basically like was the one who was trying to work with Braille. That was what I was trying to say. Sorry, I had like a brain fart for a second. Their work showed Americans that people with certain disabilities were just as capable of learning complex subjects, and they just needed the right tools and teachers. So they didn't need to just be shunned with their families for the rest of their lives. They could live normal lives like everybody else. You know, they just needed a little extra help. Okay. All right, now let's talk about mental illness. So again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday with the prison reform, but in the 1800s, people with mental illnesses were also dependent on their families. Oftentimes, families could not provide enough proper care, depending on what kind of mental illness they had. There just was not a lot of information or research on people with mental health issues, and people just didn't know how to handle that. People believed mental illnesses were permanent and that sufferers did not feel pain or temperature change, and that the mentally ill often spent many years in prisons, or sometimes the workers restrained them with chains or forced them to be alone for long periods. So if somebody had some kind of a mental illness that caused them to, you know, act out in a certain way or whatever the case may be, they just didn't know how to handle them. And so they would, you know, restrain them, they put chains on them, they would lock them in rooms, they would put them in jail, and just treat them very horribly. So today, there are laws such as the IDEA, like we just talked about, that also protect people suffering from mental illnesses or people who have, you know, different disorders. Businesses and government agencies focus on providing proper care, education, and treatment in as normal home setting as possible. Many Americans chose to care for ill family members at home and send children to public schools if they're able to. And the reformer that we have here who worked with mentally ill people was Dorothea Dix. She traveled Europe and her home state of Massachusetts to study prison conditions. Her discoveries deeply upset her, and she focused on bringing the issue to government attention. Because of Dix, Americans began to learn that with treatment, mental illnesses could improve. Her work included the founding of 32 mental hospitals and creating libraries in many hospitals and prisons. So just like we talked about yesterday, not only did she improve the conditions in prisons in general, but she also worked to help mentally ill people and people suffering from mental illnesses to provide more awareness and education on how to help those people. All right, and then the last group we have here is Temperance. So In the early 1800s, many religious groups, now remember we talked about on Tuesday, the Second Great Awakening, and how there were a lot of religious people coming out of this time period, and basically a lot of people just getting very in touch with religion again. In the early 1800s, many religious groups began discouraging the use of alcohol. They blamed many of society's problems on blamed many of society's problems, including abuse and neglect, on alcohol. So reform leaders, especially women, called for temperance, and temperance means refraining from alcohol use. So they basically were just saying, things are just not going well in America right now, and it all comes down to because everybody is drinking too much alcohol. So they were trying to get alcohol banned in America, which it actually was for a while. And then it ended up not being banned. So today, there are various groups on educating people about the harmful effects of alcohol and other substances. Laws to prevent making, selling, or consuming alcohol still exist in some places. Many drugs are illegal. Some Americans who refrain from alcohol are called teetotalers, which is a term that began in the 1830s. So there are lots of campaigns of people who still do a lot of educating on the harmful effects of drinking alcohol, drinking too much alcohol, getting addicted to alcohol, and those are still around. And the person that we have here, the reformer during this temperance movement, was Neil Dow. And Neil Dow was a mayor in Portland, Maine. He played a crucial role in the passage of the first statewide prohibition law. Prohibition was the law that made alcohol illegal. And people who were drinking alcohol, selling alcohol, making alcohol, it was all illegal. And prohibition was different from temperance because it was, it means passing laws to prevent alcohol use. So temperance meant basically just like not drinking it, but prohibition was actually just making it illegal altogether. So it was like much more drastic, basically. From 1851 to 1856, people in Maine could be arrested for making or selling alcohol. So for a while, alcohol was illegal in America, and then they ended up having to repeal that law and make it legal again because it didn't really work. There were a lot of people who were still doing it secretly, and it just didn't work. So they took it back. So now, even though alcohol is legal, they have lots of restrictions on it. Like you have to be a certain age to drink it, and there are warnings on the labels that tell you that it is harmful if you drink too much of it, and that, there are some people that can become addicted to it, if you are dependent on it and things like that. So, all right. Very good. Okay, so we have gone through all of these ones now. If you have been filling out the chart, then hopefully you got everything you needed to get. If you need to, you can go back into the textbook and look through the lesson to find some more information. Not all of the information is going to be in there in the textbook because some of these things were not in there, like the deaf and the blind, the temperance, children in poverty, those were not in the textbook. You're going to have to look on the modules, but the education, the mental illness, those things are in there, okay? But remember, this is on here, this Bring on the Reform reading, so you can go into My Learning, go in the modules, and you can look at everything in yourself. If you are in my online class, then just make sure that you have gone through this section, and that way you'll be ready to do the discussion post with me tomorrow, okay? I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. All right, bye.